Bioneers. It's my people. This is where I feel it's the birthplace. It really is a joining of the midwives, the ideas, the ingenuity, the creativity, the sparks of inspiration. Bioneers brings all of these visions and all of this action together.
There's nothing that's off the table here. It's all possible, and it's all connected, and it's so liberating.
Welcome to Free Speech TV. My name is Carl Nagan, and we're here with our continuing coverage of the 2019 Bioneers Conference. There's junk food, everybody knows about that. There's also junk media. My next guest is someone who's been trying to address both of those issues. Her name is Naomi Starkman, and she is the editor-in-chief of Civil Eats, a daily news source for critical thinking about the American food system. She's a former journalist fellow at Stanford. She has also worked as a media consultant to many leading publications and served as the deputy executive director of the City of San Francisco's Ethics Commission. Welcome to Free Speech TV.
Thank you, Carl.
Great
Nice to
have
see you.
Nice to see you too. We're kind of friends from another another world, so we're gonna try and keep this very professional as we move through these questions. So I want to ask you, what brought you, just a sort of personal reflection, what brought you to edit and create Civil Eats? What was your mission, and what from your personal background brought you to this?
Well, I have a really strange background. I started off as a lawyer. I worked in public policy. I realized that public policy is a very slow-moving tanker ship, and every time I would speak to reporters, they were able to move the needle further, faster. So I decided to kind of throw a hand grenade in my life, move to New York City, and start over. And I started working first at Newsweek, and then I worked at The New Yorker, and I worked for a number of Condé Nast titles. I helped to start Air America Radio in the 2004 election. And all the while I was thinking about how powerful media is, how the narrative is so important. And at the same time, strangely, while being in New York City, I got very interested in food and farming at a time when many people were very interested in food and farming. And I actually ended up becoming one of the first apprentices at Dan Barber's Stone Barns just outside of Manhattan. And I would take my bike on the train and take my bike out to, on the train out to Tarrytown and then farm, and then back to the New Yorker office. And I decided in 2004 or 5 to leave New York and go farm. And I farmed for about a year at a very large production farm, Helsing Junction Farms in Washington State. And all the while really questioning why there was no really thoughtful, meaningful dialogue online about food systems. I certainly was interested, and I knew many, many people were becoming more interested. And so I started Civil Eats in 2009 at probably the worst time economically, knowing that there really isn't a business model for media. And like you said, we have been accustomed to having cheap food and cheap media, and what we're getting is junk food and junk journalism. And so in this pursuit now of 10 years that I've been running Civil Eats, I've been trying to address both and really making the case for the fact that both journalism and the food system are public goods and they deserve support. And we need better policies and systems in place for both.
As you've been editor of the magazine, or the online magazine, is it right to call it a magazine?
Yes, yeah, it's fine.
How have the issues changed in the last decade? What are you focusing, what did you begin focusing on, and what are you focusing on now?
Well, I would say unique in the food media landscape in particular, we have always connected the dots between social justice and food. So the food justice beat, as it were, was something that we really started and have been very insistent on, in fact. It's the intersectionality between communities of color and the food system and climate and environmental justice. I would say that in the 10 years since we've been reporting, the thing that's really changed the most is the public's awareness of not just how their food was grown, but by whom. So looking at the people behind the food system, bringing issues around food and farm worker labor to the front have really been, by and large, the most important issues of our time, but also really understanding the issues around policy, which seem really wonky and uninteresting to many people, but actually that food is a lens into almost every aspect of how we are in this country. It's a business story, it's a cultural story, environment story, climate story.
Equity story.
It's an equity story. And so I would say the greatest change is the public's understanding of the complexity of this giant issue.
Mm-hmm. I haven't done that much reporting on food, but the one story that I did do, which was about E. coli and food safety in the Salinas Valley, I had no awareness that there was such a thing as food handlers and food manufacturers,
Right.
and that there was this whole system outside of farm to table
Right.
that I was completely unaware of. Just how big of a challenge is it to take on big ag, to take on that structural component of that's both economic and social and has all kinds of ramifications?
Well, I think it's an incredible challenge, and I don't think that the advocates who are fighting against big ag have actually been successful. My very first job out of law school was focusing on campaign finance, and everything I've ever done since really leads back to corporate support of the dollars into the pockets of policymakers in this country. And so big ag is the same thing as big energy. It's the same thing as big media. I mean, we have a corporate consolidation and lack of competition in this space. And what's interesting is that big ag is very slowly seeing the writing on the wall from consumers and has decided that it actually is trying to meet some of the consumer demand. So you see a fair amount of greenwashing happening from big ag. One very recent example is the tremendous interest and investment in plant-based foods. So now you have Impossible Burger and Beyond Meat, but you also have Tyson joining in and making plant-based meat. And so they're not interested in it because of any ecological outcomes. They're actually interested in the money. And that's where the dollars are showing them. So I think reforming big ag is a giant challenge. And I think there have been very incremental changes that I have seen.
So there's been a growing movement on the other end of the scale focused on urban gardening and homesteading. Karen Washington, the Israel Family Farm in Sacramento. What have you learned about this movement and its impact?
I think urban farming is a critical component to the food movement and food systems. It's in many countries has proven to be one of the most important pieces of food sovereignty. Oftentimes people like Miguel Altierra point to Cuba as an example of successful urban farming programs and projects. San Francisco was one of the first cities in the nation that actually created incentives for landowners to have urban farming. I think often overlooked are the social and economic benefits. There's a communal aspect to creating food security in communities where they have a lack of fresh access to food. So oftentimes these communities have been deemed food deserts. It's a term that's actually derided by many. Many prefer the term food swamp or food apartheid. In general, the concept of urban farming is about ownership in your community, about having access to land and access to food. So I think urban farming in general is a critical component to the food system. There are a lot of challenges to urban farming. We need more support for urban farmers. And at the same time, we're seeing a tremendous amount of interest in very high-tech urban farms. So indoor hydroponic vertical farming that's receiving billions of dollars that isn't really aligned with the concept of what urban farming is about with respect to the economic and community benefits.
Mm-hmm. Tell us about the rural environment and agricultural project that you have been involved with in your effort to reach out to the heartland and to the red states where there's, at least in the progressive imagination and maybe a misconception, a very conservative idea, conservative political idea about agriculture. What have you learned in your efforts to reach out to the heartland, both in the Midwest and in the Central Valley?
We have focused our reporting on rural America because if the 2016 election showed us anything, it's that there is an incredible rural-urban divide. And yet there are so many stories of success in rural America. If you look at the very first presidential debate, it was the Heartland Forum in Iowa, and it was really looking at ways in which these presidential candidates know that the center of our country is in fact the center of what we are doing, what we're producing as farmers, but also where the politics lie. So our coverage has been on every issue that you could imagine that touches farm workers and agriculture. It's about opioid addiction in farmland. It's about rural communities struggling to talk about climate change, which heretofore has been taboo, but now they're faced with incessant flooding and other climate-related damage. I think the most beneficial piece to our rural reporting project is that we're able to narrate a conversation that many people haven't been willing to listen. And our job really is to listen. Our job is to really hear what's happening on the ground, not just from conservatives or progressives, but really from people who are facing or fighting factory farming in the Midwest, from communities that are fighting pesticide degradation, and really communities who are trying to change the face of rural America in a positive way. And that's really been our privilege to be able to tell those stories.
Are you finding that, in fact, there is opposition to big ag in
Absolutely.
the Midwest?
Yeah.
Because it's destroying the family farm.
It is. And I mean, family farmers are really facing a crisis of epic proportions. Dairy farmers in particular are suffering. We just had our Secretary of Agriculture tell a group of Wisconsin dairy farmers essentially get big or get out. He could not guarantee the future security of small dairy farmers.
And the price of milk has gone.
And the price is plummeted. And so I think we are seeing a shifting tone. We're also seeing farmers adhering to conservation practices and farming in a way that makes for strange bedfellows. There's a conference that's very successful in the Midwest called the No Tills on the Plain Farming Conference. And these are farmers who don't believe in tilling up the soil and who are maybe not conventional farmers, but certainly not sustainable or organic agricultural farmers. And so there's this willingness to shift course, to change, to be innovative and creative in a way that they know best because they really are on the front lines.
Mm-hmm. Are politicians listening to them?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I don't think you would see Senator Warren or anybody spending as much time as they are in the middle of the country. Almost every single presidential candidate has introduced a rural plan or platform. Within those rural platforms, they've been focusing specifically on anti-consolidation and competitive markets for farmers. They're talking about the rural crisis in terms of agriculture, and they're focusing on solutions. So I think more than ever, we're seeing a focus on farming and agriculture from a political standpoint.
In terms of the labor force, how does the Heartland think about the immigration problem?
It's a good question. I can't speak from my own perspective, but what we've reported on and what I've seen is that it's incredibly complicated. We have an undocumented situation in our country where, by and large, most farmers who are here legally are taking part in the H-2A program, which has been largely derided by farm workers. It's problematic for farmers themselves. It's not a good solution for many. It's complicated. I think if you look at many of the co-packing companies in the Midwest, specifically animal agriculture processing facilities, by and large, those are made up of immigrant farm workers who are coming to this country. So this idea that rural America is white or conservative is actually not true. I think if you dig a little bit deeper, you'll see that many, many farm workers are from places all over the world.
Right. I want you to imagine for a moment that you could craft a new Green Deal.
Mm-hmm.
What would be some of your priorities in that?
Well, I think the first thing to consider in policy, whether it's a Green New Deal or an ag policy in general, is that we pay too many farmers too much money to plant too much of the wrong thing in too many of the wrong places. So our crop subsidy system is vastly bloated. It's about between $13 and $16 billion a year to invest in corn and soy. What's the history of that? Is that a relic of the New Deal? Is it something? It's a relic of Earl Butz, he was the plant, hedgerow to hedgerow, sort of notion of we're going to help farmers by lifting up farmers by investing in subsidies of foodstuffs that essentially become either ethanol or feedstuff for cattle, and not actually food. And it's not helping farmers. I mean, farmers are still really suffering. So the first is to really reform our crop subsidy system. The second really is to look at things that are sort of bubbling up right now. One is supply management. It's a system that's really helping Canadian dairy farmers. It's essentially price parity to help farmers have a minimum wage and not overproduce, which is leading to all sorts of problems, not just for farmers, but also things like food waste and additional greenhouse gases. And then thirdly, I would say, if I had a kind of a magic wand, I would say that really what we need is to take a serious look at true cost accounting of food. So we pay a very small amount of our household income in the United States for food. It's probably the smallest in the world. It's around 6.5%. If you're eating out for dinner, it's about 11%. Places like Japan and France, it's roughly about 13%. And places like Mexico, it's 23%. But that
Eating out?
No, household income on buying food. But that cheap food, back to your very first question, is coming at a very high price. And we are not paying for the true externalities of the food. So we're not paying for future generations paying down pesticide removal from water. We're not paying obesity and the public health crisis. Exactly. We're not looking at cleaning up factory farming. All of those factors for this very cheap, overly subsidized food system have been internalized by all of us, and our future generations will be paying for that. So I would say employing true cost accounting would be critical to really shifting how and what we think about when we think about food.
Wonderful. Naomi, is there anything you'd like to add about what you think all of us should be considering when we look at the relationship between global warming, equity, social justice issue, and food as the nexus of those challenges?
I mean, I would say that the social justice piece is front and center, and it shouldn't be considered secondarily. We are looking at communities of color being disproportionately impacted by the food system, and they are disproportionately impacted by the climate crisis. So farm workers, communities of color in high density urban environments are really on the front lines. And so that piece, the equity piece, is actually the most important piece from a social justice frame, but also just from a good policy frame. And if people could start to answer the question of how are we going to help people there first, I think it would go a long way to making a difference.
Naomi Starkman, thank you for being
Thanks
with us.
for having me, Carl.
Okay, this is great. Thank you.